A suburban illusion. Evanston, a quiet town on the outskirts of Baltimore, was a place where the passing of time often felt like a soft breeze, gentle and unnoticed. For most residents, life rolled on predictably, each day an echo of the last. One such resident was Darrell Turner, a 19-year-old with a passion for motorcycles and fixing things. He'd spent countless hours tinkering in his father's garage, dismantling engines, rebuilding old bikes, and dreaming of the day he'd open his own repair shop. That garage had become his second home, filled with the smell of motor oil and rubber, and the low hum of an old radio. Darrell had been dating Liz for nearly a year. At 18, she was intelligent and ambitious, already making plans for college, hoping to study social work. Their relationship was the talk of their high school and an example of young love full of hope and plans for the future. They spent weekends together, either at Darrell's garage or at their favorite diner, planning their dreams over milkshakes and fries. Everyone, including Darrell's friends and family, assumed they were destined for a happy future. Yet beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension was brewing. Liz's mother, Carla Whitmore, was a striking woman in her early 40s. A widow since Liz was young, Carla had built a successful real estate business, priding herself on her independence. Known for her confidence and elegance, she was a fixture in the local social scene, hosting charity events and community gatherings. She appeared to be every bit the successful, self-assured woman people admired, perhaps even envied. But Carla was lonely, a widow with no close family or friends to confide in, living in a world of shallow acquaintances and endless business meetings. Carla and Liz had always been close, sharing everything from secrets to shopping trips. But as Liz entered her teenage years, their relationship began to shift. Carla struggled with Liz's budding independence and the attention she received from others, especially Darrell. In quiet moments, Carla felt pangs of jealousy. Jealousy of her daughter's youth, her unblemished face, and the dreams she still had the chance to chase. Despite her internal conflicts, Carla kept her emotions hidden, maintaining her composed exterior. But when Liz started bringing Darrell around more often, Carla felt drawn to him in a way she hadn't anticipated. He was polite, helpful, and considerate. She admired his determination, the way he spoke about his goals with such conviction. He reminded her of the passion she'd once felt in her own life, a passion that now felt dulled by years of routines and responsibilities. Darrell, however, was oblivious to Carla's growing fascination with him. For him, Carla was simply Liz's mother, an impressive woman, certainly, but nothing more. He continued his relationship with Liz, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. However, Carla's feelings started to show in subtle, often unsettling ways. Her once casual conversations with him began to linger. Her questions about his future plans, his interests, and his life grew more personal, more intense. Liz dismissed it as her mother's curiosity, unaware of the true depth of her mother's emotions. One Saturday, while Liz was out running errands, Darrell found himself alone with Carla in her kitchen. She was baking, and he had stopped by to pick up some tools he'd left at their house after fixing a broken cabinet the week before. Carla invited him to stay a while, saying she needed help with a heavy box in the attic. Not wanting to seem rude, Darrell agreed, and they went upstairs. As they talked, Carla began to drop hints, small comments that seemed innocent but hinted at something deeper. She mentioned how difficult it was being alone, how proud she was of Darrell's drive, how he reminded her of her late husband, Robert. Darrell brushed off the compliments, smiling politely, attributing them to her generous nature. But Carla's tone lingered in his mind long after he'd left her house. Over the following weeks, Carla's advances became less subtle. She started texting him, often under the guise of asking for his advice or help with minor repairs around the house. Her messages became more frequent, laced with flattery and compliments that, while not overtly inappropriate, left Darrell feeling uncomfortable. He began to avoid her house, making excuses to Liz whenever she suggested they spend time there. But Carla was persistent, and her advances escalated. She would show up unexpectedly at his garage, bringing lunch or coffee and lingering far longer than necessary. She'd bring up memories of her husband, recounting stories of their life together, emphasizing how Daryl's personality reminded her of him. Her words grew more suggestive, her gaze lingering a little too long, her laughter just a little too familiar. Daryl felt trapped, torn between his respect for Carla and his growing discomfort with her behavior. He feared telling Liz, worried that she might not believe him, or worse, that it would destroy their relationship. So he kept it to himself, hoping Carla would eventually lose interest. But Carla's obsession only deepened. What had started as a misplaced admiration had grown into a fixation. She became convinced that Daryl was a replacement for the love she had lost, a young man who could restore the happiness she believed was stolen from her when Robert died. She told herself that it was fate, that she and Daryl were meant to be together, regardless of Liz or anyone else. One evening, unable to contain her emotions any longer, Carla cornered Daryl in the garage. She expressed her feelings openly, confessing her admiration, her loneliness, her desire for him. Shocked, Daryl stammered a response, trying to let her down gently without causing offense. He told her he cared deeply for Liz and saw her as a mother figure, nothing more. But Carla's reaction was anything but calm. Her face hardened, her voice rising as she accused him of leading her on, of toying with her emotions. Daryl tried to reassure her, but Carla's anger had flared, fueled by rejection and wounded pride. She stormed out, leaving Daryl shaken and anxious. As he watched her car speed away, he knew he had to tell Liz everything. The situation had spiraled out of control, and he feared for what might happen next. But that conversation would never happen. Unbeknownst to Daryl, Carla had already made up her mind. Her obsession had taken root too deeply, and her heart, once filled with loneliness and longing, had turned to anger and resentment. In her mind, Daryl was responsible for the pain she felt, and she was prepared to ensure he suffered as she had. Descent into obsession. After that heated confrontation in the garage, Daryl was left on edge, questioning every decision he'd made around Carla. He hadn't meant to encourage her in any way, yet somehow his innocent acts of kindness and respect had been twisted into something he could barely recognize. He couldn't understand how Carla had interpreted his respect and friendly gestures as a deeper interest, but he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a problem that could upend his life, his relationship with Liz, and perhaps even his future in Evanston. That evening, Daryl resolved to speak with Liz about everything. He would tell her the truth, as painful as it might be, and hope she would believe him. But as he walked toward her house, his phone buzzed with a text message from Carla. "I'm sorry about earlier. I overstepped. Let's forget it happened." The message should have brought relief, but something about it felt off. Carla had been so intense, her emotions so heightened, that it seemed unlikely she'd dismiss everything so suddenly. Still, Daryl decided to accept her apology, hoping she'd meant it. Maybe she really would back off, he told himself, and things could return to normal. But things did not return to normal. In the days that followed, Carla's presence only seemed to loom larger, an invisible weight pressing down on him. She continued texting him, though now her messages were more cryptic, veiled in passive aggression and cryptic remarks. She would write things like, "I hope you're happy with the choices you're making, or you won't even know what you've lost." Daryl began to realize that her fixation on him was no fleeting infatuation. It had deepened into something darker, something that gnawed at her and refused to let go. Unable to bear the anxiety any longer, Daryl finally confided in his best friend, Tony. Tony was the only person he felt he could trust with something so sensitive. Tony listened intently, shaking his head in disbelief as Daryl recounted the events that had led to his current predicament. "Dude, you've got to tell Liz," Tony said, his voice low and serious. "She needs to know. If you don't, it's just going to keep getting worse." Daryl knew Tony was right, but fear held him back. What if Liz didn't believe him? Or worse, what if she did believe him and blamed him for not telling her sooner? The thought of losing Liz weighed heavily on him, a pain he wasn't sure he could bear. Yet the pressure continued to mount, Carla's presence seeping into every aspect of his life. Meanwhile, Carla's obsession was escalating in ways Daryl couldn't even imagine. She had begun to spiral, her thoughts consumed by fantasies and scenarios in which Daryl was with her, where Liz no longer stood in the way. She found herself lurking on Daryl's social media, obsessively scrolling through photos of him and Liz together, scrutinizing every smile, every handhold, every shared glance. She would stay up late into the night, her mind racing with plans, ideas, any way to bring him closer to her and remove the obstacles between them. In a twisted attempt to reclaim some control, Carla made a bold move. One afternoon, she drove to Daryl's garage under the guise of needing a minor repair. Daryl was wary, his discomfort visible, but he was professional, handling the request quickly while keeping their conversation strictly business. As she was leaving, Carla paused, looking him straight in the eyes. "Daryl, we have something special," she whispered. "I know you feel it too. Don't throw it away because of others." Daryl, visibly shocked, took a step back. "Carla, whatever you think this is, it's not real. I'm with Liz, and I love her. Please, you have to stop this." Her face hardened, and something dark flickered in her eyes. "You'll regret this," she hissed before storming out, leaving Daryl reeling with an uneasy sense that this wasn't over. He felt trapped, like he was being stalked by a shadow he couldn't shake. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was terrifying. Daryl decided he couldn't wait any longer to tell Liz. That night, he invited her over to the garage, where he explained everything. He told her about Carla's texts, the cryptic messages, the strange behavior, and finally, the confrontations. Liz listened in silence, her face pale as she took it all in. When he finished, she looked away, her hands trembling. "You're serious," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "My mom, she's been doing this." Daryl nodded, his heart pounding. "I'm so sorry, Liz. I didn't know how to tell you sooner. I didn't want to hurt you." Liz covered her face, tears welling up in her eyes. The betrayal was evident in her expression, a blend of shock, pain, and confusion. I don't even know what to say." They spent hours talking, trying to process the mess they were entangled in. Liz was hurt, not by Daryl, but by her mother's actions. She had always admired her mother's strength and independence, but this revelation shattered her image. She promised Daryl she'd confront Carla and put an end to this once and for all. But when Liz confronted Carla, things didn't go as planned. Carla's response was cold, calculated. She dismissed Liz's accusations, accusing her of being too naive to understand adult relationships. She even turned the tables, insisting that Daryl had been the one pursuing her, manipulating Liz with his charm. Liz was stunned, unable to comprehend the words coming out of her mother's mouth. The woman she had trusted her entire life seemed unrecognizable, her features twisted with a bitterness Liz had never seen before. That night, Liz packed a bag and left, seeking refuge with her aunt. She couldn't stay under the same roof as Carla, not after the betrayal she felt. The split created a rift in their family, rumors swirling around Evanston as people noticed Liz's sudden departure. Carla felt the walls closing in, her once perfect life slipping through her fingers. Her business suffered, her social standing took a hit, and the whispers in town grew louder. In her mind, all of this was Daryl's fault. Her desperation turned into rage, her thoughts poisoned by resentment and a twisted sense of justice. She convinced herself that Daryl had taken everything from her, her daughter, her reputation, her happiness, and she vowed to make him pay. Late at night, Carla would sit alone in her darkened home, replaying her memories with Daryl, the imagined love they shared. Her mind spiraled, slipping further into darkness, driven by the all-consuming need to regain control. One evening, driven by her obsession, Carla showed up at Daryl's garage once more. This time, her demeanor was different, dangerous. She no longer cared about being subtle. She confronted him, accusing him of ruining her life, of manipulating her and destroying her family. Her words were venomous, filled with anger and sorrow, and Darryl could feel the depth of her hatred. He tried to calm her down, telling her it was all a misunderstanding, but Carla was past the point of reason. Her voice rose, her accusations turning into screams. In a flash of fury, she grabbed a wrench from the workbench and swung it at Darryl. He stumbled backward, dodging the blow but feeling the surge of adrenaline. This wasn't the Carla he thought he knew. This was someone unhinged, someone willing to destroy him. He managed to escape her grasp, running out of the garage and into the dark, hoping she wouldn't follow. But he knew this wasn't over. Carla had crossed a line, and he was no longer safe. He realized then that her obsession had transformed into something far more sinister, a destructive force that would not rest until it had consumed them both. A descent into darkness. In the days that followed the wrench incident, Darryl was on high alert. He felt as if every corner he turned hid a shadow waiting to leap out at him. Carla's face, twisted in anger, haunted him, her eyes burning with an intensity that seemed almost inhuman. Darryl began losing sleep, the weight of fear pressing down on him night after night. Every creak in the house felt amplified. Every passing car outside made him tense, and the slightest noise sent his heart racing. Tony, noticing his friend's distress, urged Darryl to consider filing a police report, but Darryl hesitated. "What can I even tell them?" he asked, exasperated. "She hasn't actually done anything. At least nothing they'd consider illegal. Who's going to believe that my girlfriend's mom has this obsession with me?" Despite his frustration, he knew Tony was right. This wasn't something he could handle alone. Liz, too, remained in turmoil, trapped between anger and disbelief. She stayed with her aunt, refusing to return home until she could find a way to confront her mother and close this chapter. But she was just as fearful of what Carla might do next. Despite everything, part of her still held on to hope that her mother would see reason, realize the damage she'd caused, and let go. But as days passed without any apology or acknowledgement, Liz felt her hope wane. For Carla, however, there was no path to letting go. Her obsession with Darryl had festered and transformed into a full-blown fixation, blurring her sense of reality. In her mind, Darryl was no longer a teenager dating her daughter. He was the missing piece in her life, the embodiment of her long-buried dreams and lost years. She couldn't understand why he was resisting her, and the more he pulled away, the more fiercely she clung to her fantasy of them being together. One evening, Carla drove by Darryl's garage, her car idling across the street as she watched him through the dusty windows. She studied his every movement, cataloging each small action as if piecing together a puzzle only she understood. In her warped perception, Darryl's retreat was not a rejection but a test, one she believed she could overcome if she just tried hard enough. But Darryl, sensing her presence, could only feel a rising sense of dread. He knew it was time to take Tony's advice. That same night, Darryl visited the local police station, where he met Officer James Harper, a seasoned but compassionate officer who had seen his share of peculiar cases in the quiet town of Evanston. Harper listened attentively as Darryl explained his situation, his discomfort at Carla's escalating behavior, and the fear that now ruled his daily life. "I understand, son," Harper said, nodding sympathetically. "This sounds like harassment, and that's something we don't take lightly. We can issue a warning or even file a restraining order if she doesn't back off. But the reality is, until she actually breaks the law, there's only so much we can do." Darryl nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. He hadn't expected a miracle, but the confirmation that his fears were valid gave him some comfort. Officer Harper promised to check in on Carla and deliver a formal warning, hoping it would be enough to dissuade her from pursuing Darryl any further. Darryl thanked him, his spirits lifted slightly as he left the station, hoping that a police warning might finally put an end to this nightmare. Meanwhile, Carla's obsession had reached a fever pitch. The following morning, Officer Harper paid her a visit, explaining in calm but firm tones that her behavior toward Daryl had been reported and that it had to stop immediately. Carla, smiling serenely, insisted that there had been a misunderstanding. She spoke to Harper with the calmness of someone discussing the weather, denying any inappropriate behavior and painting herself as a concerned mother who merely wanted to help her daughter's boyfriend. But behind her collected demeanor, Carla was seething. How dare he go to the police? How dare he make her look like a fool in her own community? Her once devoted obsession turned bitter, and she became consumed with revenge. Daryl had humiliated her, and in her twisted mind, he was responsible for all the pain she was now feeling. The fantasy she carefully constructed around him began to shatter, replaced by an intense desire to make him pay for ruining her life. That evening, Carla began to scheme, her thoughts growing darker with each passing hour. She knew where Daryl lived, where he worked, and the people he cared about. She began constructing a plan to destroy him piece by piece, convinced that only by doing so could she finally rid herself of the hold he had on her. Over the next few days, small, unsettling incidents began to occur. Daryl's motorcycle, which he had spent months meticulously repairing, was found with slashed tires and broken mirrors. The parts he had just ordered for a client's repair job went missing, setting him back and costing him money he couldn't afford to lose. At first, Daryl assumed it was random vandalism, but Tony, ever watchful, was quick to suspect Carla. "Man, you know this isn't random," Tony said, his tone serious. "No one has a reason to mess with you except her. You've got to be careful. This is her way of sending a message." Daryl's gut twisted, knowing Tony was right. The once quiet suburban life he'd known was now filled with suspicion and fear. He felt as if he were constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next incident, wondering what Carla would do next. Despite the police warning, she seemed unrelenting, her fixation mutating into a dangerous resentment. A few days later, things took a terrifying turn. Late at night, Daryl received a message from Liz, who was staying with her aunt, saying she'd heard from Carla. Her mother had texted her, asking her to come home, saying she wanted to talk and make amends. Liz, confused and unsure of her mother's true intentions, told Daryl she would go the next day, hoping that perhaps her mother had finally seen the damage she'd caused. But Daryl's instincts told him otherwise. He tried to talk her out of it, insisting that Carla's intentions might not be as innocent as they seemed. Liz, however, wanted closure. She needed answers. Against his better judgment, Daryl decided to support her decision, promising to be there for her afterward. They agreed to meet at the diner the next evening, where she could recount whatever unfolded between her and Carla. As Daryl waited in the diner the following evening, minutes turned to hours, and his unease grew. Liz had promised to meet him at 6, but by 7:30 there was still no sign of her. His calls went unanswered, and his texts remained unread. Panic began to set in, every possible worst-case scenario flashing through his mind. Tony, who was with him, suggested they go to Liz's house to check on her. Without a second thought, they jumped into Daryl's truck and drove toward Carla's place, their silence heavy with dread. As they neared the house, they noticed that the lights were off, the windows dark and foreboding. They parked across the street, watching, waiting, hoping for some sign of life. Moments later, the front door opened, and Carla stepped out, her face obscured by shadows. She paused, as if sensing their presence, then walked to her car, glancing around with a guarded expression. Daryl's heart pounded as he saw her look directly at his truck. For a moment, he feared she would confront them, but instead, she got into her car and drove off into the night. After waiting a few moments to ensure Carla was gone, Daryl and Tony quickly approached the house, knocking on the door, calling for Liz. When there was no answer, they tried the door and found it unlocked. They entered cautiously, the silence oppressive. The air was thick with tension, each creak of the floorboards echoing in their ears. As they moved through the house, They found no sign of Liz, only an empty, eerily quiet home. Daryl's pulse quickened as they reached Carla's study, where he found something that sent a chill down his spine. A framed photo of himself, taken at the garage months ago, sitting on Carla's desk. Beside it was a diary, open to a page filled with erratic, disjointed writings about Daryl, entries that bordered on incoherent ramblings, words scrawled over and over, his name encircled by strange, obsessive notes. Daryl realized, with a sickening dread, that he was dealing with someone whose mind was slipping, someone who had lost all sense of reality. As he flipped through the pages, he found more disturbing entries, plans, fantasies, even vengeful promises written in a hand that grew shakier, more erratic with each line. Just then, they heard a noise, a faint, muffled sound coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Daryl froze, listening, his heart racing. There was someone else here. Discovery in the shadows. Daryl stood motionless, straining to identify the source of the faint, muffled sound drifting through Carla's eerily quiet house. His pulse thudded in his ears, fear sharpening his senses. Beside him, Tony's eyes were wide, the same tension mirroring on his face. They exchanged a silent glance, a shared understanding that whatever lay beyond the shadows would alter everything they thought they knew. The noise persisted, a soft but steady whimper, unmistakably human and filled with a quiet desperation. Heart pounding, Daryl began to move toward the sound, feeling his way down the narrow hallway that led to the basement stairs. He had never been in this part of Carla's house before. The air felt colder here, as though the walls held secrets that shunned the warmth of daylight. He hesitated at the top of the stairs, his hand gripping the cold metal railing as he peered into the darkness below. The whimpering grew louder, tinged with fear. Daryl's mind raced, replaying every conversation, every cryptic message Carla had sent him, every sign he had ignored. Had she? He didn't dare finish the thought. Tony placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him forward. Together, they descended the stairs, step by cautious step, the creaking wood echoing around them. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room with boxes stacked along the walls. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a pale yellow light that barely penetrated the shadows. The whimper came again, more clearly this time, from behind a closed door at the far end of the room. Daryl's stomach churned. With a deep breath, he approached the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his mind bracing for what lay beyond. He twisted the knob and pushed the door open slowly. There, in the corner of a dimly lit storage room, was Liz, bound to a chair, her mouth taped shut and her eyes red and swollen from crying. Relief and horror flooded Daryl at once as he rushed forward, untying the ropes and gently pulling the tape from her mouth. Liz gasped, her voice breaking as she clung to him, her whole body trembling. "Daryl," she choked out, she's lost her mind. She kept talking about you, about how you betrayed her. I didn't know what to do. She locked me down here." Daryl held her close, anger simmering beneath his relief. He couldn't believe the lengths Carla had gone to, the danger she had placed her own daughter in. He glanced at Tony, who stood at the doorway, his face pale with shock. "We need to get out of here," Tony whispered urgently. "She could come back any moment." Daryl helped Liz to her feet, supporting her as they made their way back up the stairs. Liz was weak, her steps unsteady, but Daryl kept her close, his gaze fixed on the exit as they moved swiftly through the house. They were nearly at the door when the unmistakable sound of a car pulling into the driveway froze them in their tracks. "Daryl," Liz whispered, her voice laced with terror. "It's her." Daryl motioned for them to hide, guiding Liz and Tony to a small alcove near the entrance, where they could remain hidden but watch the front door. Carla entered moments later, her footsteps echoing through the house. She paused, as if sensing something was amiss, her head turning slightly as she looked around. "Daryl," she called out, her voice soft and haunting. "I know you're here. I saw your truck." Daryl's breath caught in his throat. Carla's tone was no longer pleading or hurt. It was cold, calculated, like someone who had decided there was no turning back. He could see the manic gleam in her eyes, the subtle twist of her lips as she scanned the room. It was as if she was a predator who had cornered her prey and was savoring the moment before the strike. Carla moved slowly, her eyes trailing over every corner of the room. "You think you can take her from me?" she murmured, her voice a chilling whisper. "You think I'll let you betray me? I was there for you, Daryl. I loved you." Daryl's jaw clenched as he held Liz close, his hand resting protectively on her back. He whispered to her, "Stay quiet, and when you get the chance, run." Tony gave him a determined nod, signaling that he was ready to act if necessary. The tension was palpable, the seconds dragging on like hours as Carla's footsteps drew closer to their hiding spot. She stopped just a few feet away, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room. Suddenly, Tony, unable to bear the silence any longer, stepped out from behind the alcove, drawing her attention away from Daryl and Liz. "Carla," he said firmly, trying to keep his voice steady, "it's over. You need help. This isn't you." Carla's face twisted into a sneer, her eyes narrowing with rage. "Help? You don't understand," she spat, her voice trembling. "He was supposed to be with me. He lied to me, made me think. But you're all against me now, aren't you?" Daryl, seizing the moment, pulled Liz to her feet, signaling for her to move quickly toward the back door. But Carla noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye, and her fury flared. "No," she shouted, lunging toward them with an intensity that left Daryl no choice. Tony stepped between them, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace, but Carla's rage blinded her. She pushed him aside, fixating solely on Daryl and Liz. Her expression was wild, her breathing ragged, as she closed the distance between them. Desperation surged within Daryl. He had no idea how far Carla was willing to go, but he wasn't willing to take any chances. He grabbed a nearby chair, placing it between them as a barricade, hoping to keep her at bay. "Carla, stop," he shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. "You're hurting your own daughter. This has to end." For a brief moment, something shifted in Carla's eyes, a flicker of recognition as she looked at Liz. Her breathing slowed, her hands dropping to her sides as she stared at her daughter, seemingly seeing her for the first time. "Liz," she whispered, her voice softening, her face crumpling with a mix of sorrow and regret. I just I wanted to be happy again." Liz, her own eyes filled with tears, took a shaky step forward. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking, "this isn't the way. You don't have to do this. Just let us go." Carla's hands trembled as she took a step back, the reality of her actions sinking in. She looked around, as if seeing the wreckage she caused for the first time. The manic glint faded from her eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunted expression. But the damage was done, and the weight of her choices hung heavily in the air. Daryl seized the opportunity, grabbing Liz's hand and leading her out of the house. Tony close behind. They didn't stop running until they reached Daryl's truck, gasping for breath as they piled inside. Daryl's hands shook as he started the engine, pulling away from Carla's house, the horror of what had just happened settling over them like a dark cloud. As they drove in silence, Liz stared out the window, her face etched with grief and disbelief. Daryl reached over, gently squeezing her hand, offering her what little comfort he could. Tony, sitting in the back, finally broke the silence. "Are you going to tell the police?" he asked, his voice low. Daryl nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We have to. She won't stop until someone makes her." They filed the report that night, recounting every disturbing detail to Officer Harbour, who listened with a grim expression. He assured them that he'd take immediate action, that he'd do everything possible to ensure Carla could no longer harm them. But as they left the station, a lingering sense of unease remained. They had seen the darkness within Carla, a darkness that wouldn't be easily banished. The following morning, a restraining order was filed against Carla, and she was mandated to attend psychological evaluations. Liz, torn between anger and sorrow, struggled to process the fact that her mother, the woman she had once admired, had become a stranger driven by obsession. The days passed slowly, and the weight of what had happened lingered between Daryl and Liz, a wound that would take time to heal. But despite everything, they leaned on each other, finding solace in their shared ordeal. They knew the scars Carla had left on their lives would remain, a reminder of how obsession, left unchecked, could spiral into unimaginable darkness. Aftershocks. The days following their escape from Carla's house were filled with a strange mix of relief and unease. Daryl and Liz spent most of their time together, seeking comfort in each other as they tried to piece their lives back together. However, the shadow of Carla's actions hung over them, a constant reminder of the trauma they had endured. Even with the restraining order and the police's assurance that Carla would be monitored, neither could shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of her. Liz wrestled with a whirlwind of emotions. The woman she'd called Mom had become someone she could barely recognize, a figure so entangled in delusion and obsession that Liz questioned if she had ever truly known her mother. She spent hours with Daryl, recounting memories of her childhood, searching for any sign she might have missed, any hint that would have foreshadowed the darkness that now consumed Carla. Was she always like this? Liz asked one evening as they sat on the back porch of Daryl's house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her voice was soft, haunted, as though speaking too loudly might summon Carla from the shadows. Daryl shook his head, his face pensive. "From everything you've told me, it sounds like she changed after your dad died. Maybe she never fully recovered, and that loss left something broken inside her." Liz nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I just don't understand why she turned her anger on us. I've always wanted to help her, but it's like she wanted to punish me for being happy. For being young." Daryl wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "You didn't do anything wrong, Liz. She made her own choices. Her pain doesn't excuse what she did to you, or to us." They sat together in silence, each lost in their thoughts as darkness settled around them. The peaceful evening air was a stark contrast to the chaos that had enveloped their lives, and yet neither could fully relax. They knew Carla's obsession had left deep scars, scars that wouldn't heal easily. The following day, Liz decided to return to her aunt's house for a while, needing time and space to process everything that had happened. Daryl supported her decision, understanding that she needed to heal on her own terms. They promised to stay in touch, to be there for each other, but both knew that their relationship had been fundamentally changed by the events they'd endured. While Liz focused on mending her relationship with herself, Daryl tried to reclaim his own life, returning to the garage he loved. But even the comforting smell of motor oil and the familiar sound of engines couldn't fully ease his mind. Carla's actions had left an invisible stain on his world. No matter how hard he tried to focus on his work, he couldn't shake the memories of her fixation, the image of her manic eyes, the terror of that night. One afternoon, Tony dropped by the garage, noticing Daryl's preoccupation as he tinkered with an old motorcycle. "Hey, man, you holding up okay?" he asked, his tone light but concerned. Daryl shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. "I guess. Just, everything's different now, you know. It feels like I'll never be able to get her out of my head." Tony leaned against a workbench, crossing his arms. "You went through something intense, Daryl. It's going to take time. But you have people who care about you. Don't keep it bottled up." Daryl nodded, grateful for Tony's presence. They spent the next few hours working side by side, the steady rhythm of their labor offering a small sense of normalcy. Yet even as they laughed and joked, Daryl could feel a heaviness in the air, a sense that Carla's influence still lingered, lurking at the edges of his life. And then, just as things began to feel almost normal, a letter arrived. Daryl found it on his doorstep, tucked neatly under the welcome mat. His heart sank as he recognized the handwriting. Carla's. Trembling, he opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the words scrawled in a shaky, barely legible hand. "Daryl, I know what I did was wrong, but you have to understand. I was lost, alone, and desperate. You were the only light in my life, the only one who made me feel alive again. I've been betrayed by so many people, but I never thought you'd be one of them. I hope you'll forgive me someday. Carla." He crumpled the letter in his hand, feeling a surge of anger. Forgiveness, after everything she had put them through. The letter felt like a violation, a twisted attempt to justify her actions and make him complicit in her delusion. He knew he should report it to the police, but something stopped him. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much she had rattled him. Instead, he burned the letter, watching as the flames consumed the paper, reducing Carla's words to ashes. Yet, even as he watched the letter disintegrate, he knew it wouldn't be the end. She was still out there, somewhere, nursing her anger and delusion, waiting for her next move. The days turned into weeks, and the fear Carla instilled began to fade, replaced by a guarded vigilance. Liz returned to her aunt's house, and although they spoke regularly, their conversations were filled with a shared silence, an understanding of the pain they both carried but couldn't articulate. But just as they began to believe Carla was truly gone, she made one final, desperate attempt to reclaim her hold over them. It was late one night when Daryl's phone rang. He answered groggily, only to hear Liz's panicked voice on the other end. "Daryl," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw her, outside my window. She's watching me." Daryl shot out of bed, his heart racing. "Where are you now?" "I'm at my aunt's house, but she's out of town for the weekend." "Daryl, I'm scared. I don't know what she's planning," but she looked different. She looked like she's lost everything, like she has nothing left to lose. Without another word, Daryl grabbed his keys and sped toward Liz's location, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. As he drove, he called Officer Harper, explaining the situation and urging him to send someone to check on Liz. When he arrived, he found Liz huddled near the front door, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. He pulled her into his arms, comforting her as best he could, whispering assurances that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. Minutes later, Officer Harper arrived with 2 patrol cars. They searched the area around the house, combing through the nearby streets and alleys, but found no sign of Carla. Harper tried to reassure them, suggesting it could have been a case of mistaken identity, someone who resembled Carla. But Daryl knew Liz wouldn't make that kind of mistake. Carla was here, somewhere, watching, waiting. Her desperation had turned into something darker, a reckless abandon that made her unpredictable and dangerous. As the officers left, Harper pulled Daryl aside. "I'm going to keep a close watch, but I need you two to stay vigilant. People like Carla, they don't just let go. She's lost her grip on reality, and that makes her even more dangerous." Daryl nodded, feeling the weight of the warning settle heavily on his shoulders. He stayed with Liz that night, neither of them sleeping, both on edge, waiting for the next move. Carla's absence felt like a looming threat, an unspoken promise that she wasn't done with them. The following days were a blur of anxiety and watchfulness. Every phone call, every knock on the door, sent a chill through them. The police increased their patrols, and Liz's aunt even installed security cameras. But no one could fully shake the feeling that Carla was watching, plotting her next move from the shadows. For Daryl and Liz, life had become a delicate balance of hope and fear, a constant struggle to reclaim their peace while remaining vigilant against the woman who had shattered their lives. They knew the scars Carla had left would take a lifetime to heal, but they clung to the hope that one day they would be free. Yet, somewhere in the back of their minds, a lingering thought remained. As long as Carla was out there, her obsession would never truly end. Breaking free. The uncertainty hung heavy over Daryl and Liz like a storm cloud, casting long shadows over their every move. The sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, and the fear that Carla could appear at any moment had worn them down. Yet despite it all, a part of each of them refused to surrender. They wanted their lives back. They wanted a sense of peace, of finality, something that would allow them to move forward. Weeks passed without any sign of Carla. The police kept up their patrols, and Daryl and Liz took every precaution, even considering leaving Evanston altogether. But uprooting their lives felt like letting Carla win, like she would continue to haunt them wherever they went. Then, one night, everything changed. Liz was staying at her aunt's house, who had returned from her trip, and was now aware of the gravity of the situation. That evening, as Liz was preparing for bed, her aunt called her over, her face creased with worry. "Liz, there's someone outside," she whispered, glancing toward the window. They peered through the curtains and saw a figure standing in the shadows across the street, barely visible in the dim glow of a streetlight. It was Carla. She was standing motionless, staring directly at the house, as if contemplating her next move. Liz felt a chill run through her. She called Daryl, her voice trembling. "She's here, Daryl. She's right outside." "I'm on my way," he replied without hesitation, grabbing his keys and heading for his truck. He called Officer Harper, who promised to meet him there. The fear and anger mixed within him as he sped toward Liz's house, determined that this would be the end of it. When he arrived, Harper and another officer were already there, speaking with Liz and her aunt. They formulated a plan, quietly discussing how to approach Carla without escalating the situation. Harper advised Daryl and Liz to stay inside while he and the other officers made contact. As the officers crossed the street, Carla seemed to notice them for the first time. She backed away, her gaze wild, flicking between the approaching officers and the house where she knew Daryl and Liz were watching. Harper spoke gently, trying to calm her, but Carla's eyes were glazed with a determination that bordered on desperation. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice tinged with fear and anger. "You don't understand. I just need to talk to them. They owe me that much." Harper continued to approach, his voice steady. "Carla, we can talk. Let's go somewhere quiet, where you can explain everything. We want to help you." But Carla shook her head, taking another step back. "Help? No one has tried to help me. They're the ones who turned on me, who betrayed me. Daryl, he was supposed to care about me. He lied. They all lie." Inside, Liz's aunt kept her arms around Liz, who watched the scene unfolding outside with a mixture of horror and pity. For a brief moment, Liz saw her mother not as the dangerous, obsessed figure she had become, but as a woman broken by her own unresolved pain and loneliness. Yet Liz also knew that pity couldn't excuse what Carla had done, or the trauma she had inflicted on them both. Daryl stood by the window, watching with clenched fists, feeling an odd sense of resolution. This needed to end tonight, one way or another. Outside, Carla's gaze shifted back to the house, her expression twisted as she caught sight of Daryl through the window. In a flash, she broke into a run, moving toward the house with a wild, unhinged desperation. Harper and the officers shouted for her to stop, but she ignored them, her focus locked solely on Daryl. Daryl barely had time to react before Carla was at the door, pounding on it, her voice shrill and broken. "Let me in, Daryl. Just let me in. I need to talk to you." Daryl could see the desperation in her eyes, the way she clung to the last shreds of her obsession. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm, knowing that facing her might be the only way to finally close this chapter. He opened the door just a crack, enough to look her in the eyes without letting her in. "Carla, it's over," he said, his voice low and steady. "You need help. You can't keep doing this. To me, to Liz, or to yourself." Her face twisted, a flicker of hurt crossing her features, as if she couldn't comprehend his rejection. "I just wanted us to be happy," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought you felt the same." Daryl shook his head, a deep sadness mingling with his resolve. "I never led you on, Carla. You created this idea, this story in your mind, but it was never real. And now, it's hurting everyone." Carla's expression shifted, the pain giving way to anger. "You're just like the others," she spat, her voice rising. "You're all the same. Cruel, lying, betraying. You'll regret this, Daryl. I promise you." Before he could respond, Harper stepped forward, gently but firmly guiding Carla away from the door. She struggled briefly, but then went limp, as if the fight had drained out of her. Her gaze remained locked on Daryl, her eyes hollow, as the officers led her away. They took her to the station for a psychological evaluation, where a specialist determined that Carla was suffering from a severe delusional disorder. The doctor explained that the traumatic loss of her husband had likely fractured her sense of reality, leading her to latch onto Daryl as a replacement for the love and stability she had lost. Her obsession had festered in isolation, growing into something toxic and uncontrollable. Harper informed Daryl and Liz of the findings, explaining that Carla would be admitted to a psychiatric facility for treatment. She would be closely monitored, with strict orders to prevent her from contacting either of them. It wasn't the resolution Daryl had expected, but it was one that brought him a sense of closure. Carla would get the help she needed, and he and Liz could finally start to heal. Over the following weeks, a sense of normalcy began to return to their lives. Liz returned to her aunt's house permanently, finding solace in the company of family, and slowly rebuilding her sense of safety. The darkness Carla had brought into their lives began to lift, replaced by a quiet peace. Daryl, too, found himself reclaiming his life. He returned to the garage full-time, the familiar rhythm of his work providing a comfort he hadn't felt in months. Every time he picked up a wrench, every engine he repaired, felt like a step toward leaving the past behind. He and Liz continued to see each other, their bond deepened by the trials they had endured together. One evening, several months after Carla's hospitalization, Daryl and Liz went for a walk along the lake, the setting sun casting golden hues across the water. They spoke quietly, reflecting on everything they had gone through, the pain they had faced, and the resilience they had found within themselves. "I feel like a part of me will always carry this," Liz said, her voice soft. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe it'll make me stronger." Daryl nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "We both learned something from this, about strength and about boundaries, and most of all, about not letting anyone take control of our lives." As they walked, they felt the weight of the past finally lifting, replaced by a renewed sense of freedom and hope. They had faced the darkness together and emerged with a bond that couldn't be shaken, forged in the fire of hardship. For Daryl and Liz, the future was once again open, full of possibilities, and as they looked out over the calm waters of the lake, they knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, freed from the shadows of obsession and fear.